Hi everyone, were any of the sons of King Arthur actually real people? Are there any historical documents that support the existence of any of them? Well, one particularly notable son of Arthur, who appears in Culhwch and Olwen, a legend from around about 1100, is Gwydre. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. It's something like Gwydre. And you can see his name on the screen. And he, in this legend, Culhwch and Olwen, he is said to have fought in Arthur's army and then he died. That's all he does in the tale. So we don't really know very much about him, which is unfortunate. However, based on when this tale appears to be set, by looking at the context of the story in Culhwch and Olwen, it seems to be set about a year after the Battle of Badon. And since Gwydre is presented as obviously an adult son because he's fighting in Arthur's army and then he dies in battle, he would appear to have been probably Arthur's eldest son. We can't be absolutely certain about this, but there's no other son of Arthur's in the legends who definitely has to be earlier than Gwydre, or as early as him. All the others seem to be associated with slightly later events. So it appears, although it's a flimsy conclusion, but based on what we have, it does appear to be the case that Gwydre was the eldest son of Arthur, probably. So that's one useful bit of information. So with that in mind, it's interesting when we compare this to the Athrois theory. So this is the theory that King Arthur can be identified with a historical king of southeast Wales called Athrois. At least in the available records, he's called Athrois. My belief is that this is actually just a corruption of the name Arthur, or Arturus, or something like that. So I don't think his name was actually Athrois, but that's how it's been preserved to us in the surviving records from centuries after the fact. So anyway, he was a king of southeast Wales, and I and many other people believe that he was the historical Arthur. So how does this tie in with Gwydre? Well, what's interesting is that the Book of Llandaf from the 12th century contains various witness lists to land grants. And one of these land grants refers to Morgan, the son of Athrois, and it also refers to another figure who might be identifiable as Gwydre from the legend. The text in question, the land grant, reads, "King Morgan, son of Athrois, with his heir Gwydre, granted the village of Gwylbiew for his son and for the soul of his grandfather, Myric, son of Tudrig, to Odysseus the bishop." So why is that so interesting? Well, as you can see from this passage, there's this figure, this heir, called Gwydre. Now, when you consider both names on the screen, you can see that they're fairly similar. They have a vague similarity to them, even though they're not identical or anything like that, but they have a vague similarity. But this similarity gets a lot stronger when we consider some other figures who had that same name, Gwydre, and when we see how that name was rendered in some other records, some other documents, we see that it's actually very, very close indeed to the name of Arthur's legendary son. There's one figure who's particularly notable in this context, and he appears in Peter Bartram's A Welsh Classical Dictionary as Gwydre here ap Caradog. And he was from the kingdom of Powys. So what's interesting is that we find in the records about him is that sometimes his name was written as Gwydre, which is pretty much exactly the same as the name in the Book of Llandaf. It's just a different spelling, but the name is identical. Whereas in other records about this same person, we find his name written as Gwydre, which is, again, basically identical to the name of Arthur's son. The only difference is the name of Arthur's son has an E on the end, whereas the name of this figure doesn't. So what does this show? Well, this shows that the name of this figure who appears in the Book of Llandaf could also be written alternatively as basically the same as the form that we find in the context of King Arthur's son. In other words, Gwydre and Gwydre could be used as alternative spellings for the same person. Whether they are actually the same name, I don't know. But the point is that this figure from Powys proves that these two names were clearly considered to be so similar that they could be used as alternative spellings for the same person. So how does that relate to the issue of, was King Arthur's son real? Well, this means that there's a good chance that the figure who appears in the Book of Llandaf with this name is in fact King Arthur's son. So remember, I said that there's this identification of Athrois with Arthur. This is the identification that I believe in, and various others as well, but that's a topic for another matter. Actually, I suppose it isn't. But the point is that if Athrois was Arthur, then could this son, could this heir, Gwydre, in the Book of Llandaf, could he be the historical Gwydre from the legends of King Arthur? Well, when we look at the text, we see that he's called his heir. And remember, earlier I mentioned that it appears from the evidence that we have that the son of Arthur, called Gwydre, was his heir, his eldest son. So logically he would be his heir. So is it possible here that this is the heir in question? Well, the problem is it's a bit ambiguous. The text says, King Morgan, son of Athrois, with his heir. So it's not clear if his heir is a reference to Morgan's heir or Athrois's heir. If it was the heir of Athrois, who was the last figure just mentioned, then, well, that would indicate that, yes, this very well could be Gwydre, the son of Arthur, with Arthur being Athrois. On the other hand, if his heir is a reference to the first person mentioned, which was Morgan, then that would logically mean that Gwydre here is actually the grandson of Athrois, not his son. So that would mean it was Morgan's heir, logically Morgan's son, hence Athrois's grandson. So that's where it gets a bit complicated. It's impossible to know for sure if he's supposed to be the heir of Morgan or the heir of Athrois. The wording is ambiguous. And then, of course, there's the important issue of, was he still alive when this land grant was given? Because this land grant, as you saw, was given to Bishop Odysseus, but he didn't become bishop until probably 570, which is about 20 years after the Battle of Badon, according to my chronology. It's definitely long after the Battle of Badon, according to anyone's chronology. So the point is that if Gwydre here is still alive in this passage, then that means that he can't be Gwydre, the son of King Arthur, because he died decades ago. He died well before Odysseus was bishop. The problem is that, again, it's ambiguous. So here it mentions that he granted the village for his soul and for the soul of his grandfather. So his grandfather, logically, had died already. When it uses this expression for the soul of someone, it's referring to the fact that the person has already died. So the fact that it refers to for his soul could well indicate that the heir in question had already died. And so he was only with his heir, with Gwydre, in a kind of figurative sense. Similarly, throughout the Book of Llandaf, we find that references are made to kings giving land to bishops that had already died in the hands of another bishop who was still alive. So the concept of being with someone or presenting something to someone who was already dead isn't an unprecedented idea in the Book of Llandaf. So I think it's workable. Whether or not this actually is the case, I don't know. It's ambiguous. Like I said, you can make a case for it, definitely, because there's the fact that it says that Morgan gave the village for his soul and for the soul of his grandfather Myric. So I think that tips the scales towards his heir was dead and just with him in a figurative sense. Plus, in the witness list that accompanies this, the figure Gwydre doesn't appear, so he doesn't seem to have actually been there. So I think a good case can be made that this figure, Gwydre, was dead and was just with him in a figurative sense, and also we can make the case that he was actually the heir of Athrois rather than the heir of Morgan. But again, it's kind of ambiguous, so you could make a case against that as well. But nevertheless, even in a worst case scenario, what does this prove? Well, in a worst case scenario, this shows that this name, which could be used as an alternative form of the name of Arthur's son in the legends, was used by that very dynasty, the dynasty of Athrois, at that very time. So this is circumstantial evidence supporting the existence of this figure, and also, likewise, it corresponds to the Atheros theory, because names tend to be reused within the same dynasty, and also names tend to have eras of popularity. So the fact that this name was used at that time by this very dynasty is supporting evidence of the existence of Gwydre, the son of King Arthur, even if this specific figure wasn't actually the same as that son of Arthur, although I think he very well may have been. Now here's another question for you. Was the Eye of the Sahara really Atlantis? Well, if you'd like to see my viewpoint on that subject, then come back next time for my next video.